Hey, I'm back. It's been over a week since last read. Sorry, folks, just week got away from me. Busy, lots of stuff to do. The occasional social obligation, the occasional social pleasure. uh, but yeah, we're here, and it's time for chapter 5. I'm gonna wait like maybe a minute or two, and then let's get started. All right, I think let's just get started. Wait for just a minute here. Chapter 5. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. Oh my god, I immediately lost my spot because I zoomed in just a little bit on the text and it changed the whole page configuration. Okay, here we are. I am not going to try to describe point by point all that happened the next half hour because there was too much of it, and it involved all three of us, sometimes doing different things at the same time. And although we were told a lot of things, we were seldom, if ever, told the why of them. And through it all was the constant impression that we were dealing with human beings. I almost left out the human, and I'm still not absolutely sure whether I shouldn't, of vastly greater scope, and probably intelligence too, than ourselves. And that was just the basic confusion, to give it a name. After a while, the situation got more difficult, as I'll try to tell in due course. To begin with, it was extremely weird to plunge from a rather leisurely confab about a fairy tale fellowship of non-practicing murderers into a shooting war between a violet blob and a dark red puddle on a shadowy fluorescent map. The voice didn't throw any great shining lights on this topic because after the first, and perhaps unguarded revelation, we learned little more of the war between Atla High and Savannah Fortress, and nothing of the reasons behind it. Presumably Savannah was the aggressor, reaching out north after the conquest of Birmingham, but even that was just a guess. It is hard to describe how shadowy it all felt to me. There were some minutes while my mind kept mixing up the whole thing with what I'd read long ago about the Civil War. Savannah was Lee, Atla High was Grant, and we'd been dropped spang in the middle of the Second Battle of the Wilderness. Apparently, the Savannah Plains had some sort of needle ray as part of their armament. At any rate, I was warned to watch out for swinging lines in the haze like straight strings of pink stars, and later told to aim at the sources of such lines. And naturally, I guessed that the steel cubes must be some crucial weapon for Atla High, or ammunition for a weapon, or parts for some essential instrument like a giant computer. But the voice ignored my questions on that point, and didn't fall into the couple of crude conversational traps I tried to set. We were to drop the cubes when told, that was all. Pop had the box of them closed again and rigged to the parachute. He took over that job because Alice and me were busy with other things when the instructions on that came through, and he was told how to open the door of the plane for the drop. You just held your hand steadily on a point beside the door. But, as I say, that was all. Naturally, it occurred to me that once we made the drop, Atlahai would have no more use for us, and might simply let us be destroyed by Savannah or otherwise, perhaps want us to be destroyed, so that it might be wisest for us to refuse to make the drop when the signal came and hang on to those myriad steel cubes as our only bargaining point. Still, I could see no advantage to refusing before the signal came. I'd have liked to discuss the point with Alice, and maybe Pop too, but apparently everything we said, even whispered, could be overheard by Atlahai. We did never determine, incidentally, whether Atlahai could see into the cabin of the plane also. I don't believe they could, though they sure had it bugged for sound. All in all, we found out almost nothing about Atlahai. In fact, 3 witless germs traveling in a cabin in an iron filing wasn't a bad description of us at all. As I often say of my deductive faculties, think, schmink. But Atlahai, always meaning, of course, the personality behind the voice from the screen, found out all it wanted about us, and apparently knew a good deal to start with. For one thing, they must have been tracking our plane for some time, because they guessed it was on automatic and that we could reverse its course, but nothing else. Though they seemed under the impression that we could reverse its course to Los Alamos, not the cracking plant. Here, obviously, I did get a new nugget of data, though it was just about the only one. For a moment, the voice from the screen got real unguarded, anxious, as it asked, "Do you know if it is true that they have stopped dying at Los Alamos, or are they merely broadcasting that to cheer us up?" I answered, "Oh, yes, they're all fine," to that, but I couldn't have made it very convincing, because the next thing I knew, the voice was getting me to admit that we'd only boarded the plane somewhere in the Central Deathlands. I even had to describe the cracking plants and freeway and gas tanks. I couldn't think of a lie that mightn't get us into as much trouble as the truth, and the voice said, "Oh, did Grail stay there?" And I said, "Yes," and braced myself to do some more admitting or some heavy lying as the inspiration took me. But the voice continued to skirt around the question of what exactly had happened to Grail. I guess they knew well enough we'd bumped him off, but didn't bring it up because they needed our cooperation. They were handling us like children, or savages, you see. One pretty amazing point, Atlahai apparently knew something about Pop's fairy tale fellowship of non-practicing murderers, because when he had to speak up while he was getting instructions on preparing stuff for the drop, the voice said, "Excuse me, but you sound like one of those MA boys." Murderers Anonymous, Pop had said some of their boys called their unorganized organization. "Yep, I am," Pop admitted uncomfortably. "Well, a word of advice then, or perhaps I only mean gossip," the screen said, for once getting on a sidetrack. "Most of our people do not believe you are serious about it, although you may think you are. Our skeptics, which includes all but very few of us, split quite evenly between those who think that the MA spirit is a terminal psychotic illusion, and those who believe it is an elaborate ruse in preparation for some concerted attack on cities by Deathlanders." "Can't say that I blame the either of them," was Pop's only comment. "I think I'm nuts myself, and a murderer forever." Alice glared at him for that admission, but it seemed to do us no damage. Pop really did seem out of his depth Pop really did seem out of his depth, though, during this part of our adventure. More out of his depth than even Alice and me. I mean, as if he could only really function in the Deathland with Deathlanders, and wanted to get everything else over quickly. I think one reason Pop was that way was that it was feeling very intensely something that I was feeling myself. A sort of sadness and bewilderment that beings as smart as the voice from the screen sounded should still be fighting wars. Murder, as you must know by now, I can understand and sympathize with deeply, but war, no. Oh, I can understand cultural queers fighting city squares, and even get a kick out of it and whoop 'em on. But these Atlahai and Alamos folks seemed a different sort of cat altogether, though I'd only come to that point of view today. The kind of cat that ought to have outgrown war or thought its way around it. Maybe Savannah Fortress had simply forced the war on them, and they had to defend themselves. I hadn't contacted any Savannans. They might be as blood simple as the Porterites. Still, I don't know that it's always a good excuse that somebody else forced you into war. That sort of justification can keep on until the end of time. But who's a germ to judge? A minute later, I was feeling doubly like a germ, and a very lowly one, because the situation had just got more difficult and depressing too. The thing had happened that I said I'd tell you about in due course. The voice was just repeating its instructions to Pop on making the drop when it broke off of a sudden, and a second voice came in, a deep voice with a sort of European accent. Not Chinese, oddly. Not talking to us, I think, but to the first voice, and overlooking or not caring that we should hear. Also tell them, the second voice said, that we will blow them out of the sky the instant they stop obeying us. If they should hesitate to make the drop, or if they should put a finger on the button that reverses their course, then poof! Such brutes understand only the language of force. Also warn them that the blocks are atomic grenades that will blow them out of the sky, too, if... Dr. Kowalski, will you permit me to point out? The first voice interrupted, getting as close to expressing irritation as I imagine it ever allowed itself to do. Then, both voices cut off abruptly, and the screen was silent for 10 seconds or so. I guess the first voice thought it wasn't nice for us to overhear Atlahai bickering with itself, even if the second voice didn't give a damn any more than a farmer would mind pigs overhearing him squabble with his hired man. Of course, this guy seemed to overlook that we were killer pigs, but there wasn't anything we could do in that line just now except get burned up. When the screen came on again, it was just the first voice talking once more, but it had something to say that was probably the result of rapid conference and compromise. Attention, everyone. I wish to inform you that the plane in which you are traveling can be exploded, melted in the air, rather, if we activate a certain control at this end. We will not do so now or subsequently if you make the drop when we give the signal, and if you remain on your present course until then. Afterwards, you will be at liberty to reverse your course and escape as best you may. Let me re-emphasize that when you told me you had taken over for Grail, I accepted that assertion in full faith and still so accept it. Is that all fully understood? We all told him yes, though I don't imagine we sounded very happy about it, even Pop. However, I did get that funny feeling again that the voice was being really sincere. An illusion, I supposed, but still a comforting one. Now, while all these things were going on, believe it or not, and while the plane continued to bullet through the orange haze, which hadn't shown any foreign objects in it so far, thank God, even vultures, let alone straight strings of pink stars, I was receiving a cram course in gunnery. Do you wonder why I don't try to tell this part of my story consecutively? It turned out that Alice had been brilliantly right about one thing. If you pushed some of the buttons simultaneously in patterns of 5, they unlocked, and you could play on them like organ keys. 2 sets of 5 keys, played properly, would rig out a sight just in front of the viewport and let you aim and fire the plane's main gun in any forward direction. There was a rearward firing gun, too, that you aimed by changing over the world screen to a rear-view TV window, but we didn't get around to mastering that one. In fact, in spite of my special talents, it was all I could do to achieve a beginner's control over the main gun, and I wouldn't have managed even that except that Alice, from the thinking she'd been doing about patterns of 5, was quick at understanding from the voice's descriptions which buttons were meant. She couldn't work them herself, of course, what with her stump and burned hand, but she could point them out for me. After 20 minutes of drill, I was a gunner of sorts, sprawled in the right-hand kneeling seat and intently scanning the onrushing orange haze, which at last was beginning to change toward the bronze of evening. If something showed up in it, I'd be able to make a stab at getting a shot in. Not that I knew what my gun fired, the voice was not giving away any unnecessary data. Naturally, I had asked why didn't the voice teach me to fly the plane so that I could maneuver in case of attack, and naturally the voice had told me it was out of the question, much too difficult, and besides, they wanted us on a known course so they could plan better for the drop and recovery. I think maybe the voice would have given me some hints, and maybe even told me more about the steel cubes too, and how much danger we were in from them, if it hadn't been for the second voice, which presumably had issued from a being who was keeping watch to make sure, among other things, that the first voice didn't get soft-hearted. So, there I was, being a front gunner. Actually, a part of me was getting a big bang out of it, from antique banker's special to needle cannon, or whatever it was. But at the same time, another part of me was disgusted with the idea of acting like I belonged to a live culture, even a smart, unqueer one, and working in a war, even just so as to get out of it fast, while a third part of me, one that I normally keep down, was very simply horrified. Pop was back by the door with the box and chute, ready to make the drop. Alice had no duties for the moment, but she'd suddenly started gathering up food cans and packing them in one bag. I couldn't figure out at first what she had in mind. Orderly housewife wouldn't be exactly my description of her occupational personality. Then, of course, everything had to happen at once. The voice said, "Make the drop!" Alice crossed to Pop and thrust out the bag of cans toward him, writhing her lips in silent talk to tell him something. She had a knife in her burnt hand, too. But I didn't have any time to do lip reading, because just then a glittering pink asterisk showed up in the darkening haze ahead, a whole half-dozen straight lines spreading out from a blank central spot, as if a super-fast, gigantic spider had laid in the first strands of its web. Wind whistled as the door of the plane started to open. I fought to center my sight on the blank central spot, which drifted toward the left. One of the straight lines grew dazzlingly bright. I heard Alice whisper fiercely, "Drop these!" In the part of my mind that couldn't be applied to gunnery, instantly deduced that she'd had some last-minute inspiration about dropping a bunch of cans instead of the steel cubes. I got the sight centered and held down the firing combo. The thought flashed to me, "It's a city you're firing at, not a plane," and I flinched. The dazzlingly pink line dipped down toward me. Behind me, the sound of a struggle, Alice snarling and Pop giving a grunt. Then all at once a scream from Alice, a big whoosh of wind, a flash way ahead where I'd aimed, a spatter of hot metal inside the cabin, a blinding spot in the middle of the world screen, a searing beam inches from my neck, an electric shock that lifted me from my seat and ripped at my consciousness. When I came to, if I really ever was out, seconds later at most, there were no more pink lines. The haze was just its disgustingly tawny evening self with black spots that were only after images. The cabin stunk of ozone, but wind funneling through a hole in the one-time world screen was blowing it out fast enough. Savannah had gotten in one lick all right, and we were falling. The plane was swinging down like a crippled bird. I could feel it, and there was no use kidding myself. But staring at the control panel wouldn't keep us from crashing if that was in the cards. I looked around, and there were Pop and Alice glaring at each other across the closing door. He looked mean. She looked agonized and was pressing her burnt hand into her side with her elbow as if he'd stamped on the hand, maybe. I didn't see any blood, though. I didn't see the box and chute either, though I did see Alice's bag of groceries. I guessed Pop had made the drop. Now, it occurred to me, was a bully time for Voice 2 to melt the plane, if he hadn't already tried. My first thought had been that the spatter of hot metal had come from the Savannah craft spitting us, but there was no way to be sure. I looked around at the viewport in time to see rocks and stunted trees jump out of the haze. Good old Ray, I thought, always in at the death. But just then the plane took a sickening bounce, as if its anti-gravity had only started to operate within yards of the ground. Another lurching fall, and another bounce, less violent. A couple of repetitions of that, each one a little gentler, and then we were sort of bumping along on an even keel with the rocks and such, sliding past fast, about 100 feet below, I judged. We'd been spoiled for altitude work, it seemed, but we could still cripple along in some sort of low-power repulsion field. I looked at the North American screen and buttons, wondering if I should start us back west again, or leave us set on Atla High and see what the hell happened. At the moment, I hardly cared what else Savannah did to us. I needn't have wasted the mental energy. The decision was made for me. As I watched, the Atla High button jumped up by itself, and the button for the cracking plant went down, and there was some extra bumping as we swung around. Also, the violet patch of Atla High went real dim, and the button for it no longer had a violet nimbus. The Los Alamos blue went dull too. The cracking plant dot glowed a brighter green. That was all. All except for one thing. As the violet dimmed, I thought I heard voice one, very faintly, not as if speaking directly, but as if the screen had heard and remembered, not a voice, but the fluorescent ghost of one. Thank you, and good luck. All right, let's read chapter 6. Hang on, though. Okay, just had to clean my glasses real quick. All right, chapter 6. Many a man has dated his ruin from some murder or other that perhaps he thought little of at the time. Thomas de Quincey. And a long merry siege to you, sir, and roast rat for Christmas, I responded, very out loud and rather to my surprise. War! How I hate war! That was what Pop exploded with. He didn't exactly dance in senile rage. He was still keeping too sharp a watch on Alice, but his voice sounded that way. Damn you, Pop! Alice contributed. And you too, Ray. We might have pulled something, but you had to go obedience happy. Then her anger got the better of her grammar, or maybe Pop and me was corrupting it. Damn the both of you, she finished. It didn't make much sense, any of it. We were just cutting loose, I guess, after being scared to say anything for the last half hour. I said to Alice, I don't know what you could have pulled, except the chain on us. To Pop, I remarked, you may hate war, but you sure helped that one along. Those grenades you dropped will probably take care of a few hundred Savannans. That's what you always say about me, isn't it? He snapped back. But I don't suppose I should expect any kinder interpretation of my motives. To Alice, he said, I'm sorry I had to slap your burnt fingers, sister, but you can't say I didn't warn you about my low-down tactics. Then to me again, I do hate war, Ray. It's just murder on a bigger scale, though some of the boys give me an argument there. Then why don't you go preach against war in Atla High and Savannah? Alice demanded, still very hot, but not quite so bitter. Yeah, Pop, how about it? I seconded. Maybe I should, he said, thoughtful all at once. They sure need it. Then he grinned. Hey, how would this sound? Hear the world-famous murderer, Pop Trumbull, talk against war. Wear your steel throat protectors. Pretty good, hey? We all laughed at that, grudgingly at first, then with a touch of wholeheartedness. I think we all recognized that things weren't going to be very cheerful from here on in, and we'd better not turn up our noses at the feeblest fun. I guess I didn't have anything very bright in mind, Alice admitted to me. Well, to Pop, she said, All right, I forgive you for the present. Don't, Pop said with a shudder. I hate to think of what happened to the last bugger who made the mistake of forgiving me. We looked around and took stock of our resources. It was time we did. It was getting dark fast, although we were chasing the sun, and there weren't any cabin lights coming on, and we sure didn't know of any way of getting any. We wadded a couple of satchels into the hole in the world screen without trying to probe it. After a while, it got warmer again in the cabin, and the air a little less dusty. Presently, it started to get too smoky from the cigarettes we were burning, but that came later. We screwed off the walls the few storage bags we hadn't inspected. They didn't contain nothing of consequence, not even a flashlight. I had one last go at the buttons, though there weren't any left with nimbuses on them. The darker it got, the clearer that was. Even the Atlahai button wouldn't push now that it had lost its violet halo. I tried the gunnery patterns, figuring to put in a little time taking pot shots at any mountain that turned up, but the buttons that had been responding so well a few minutes ago refused to budge. Alice suggested different patterns, but none of them worked. That console was really locked. Maybe the shot from Savannah was partly responsible, though Atlahai remote locking things was explanation enough. "The buggers," I said. "They didn't have to tie us up this tight. Going east, we at least had a choice, forward or back. Now we got none." "Maybe we're just as well off," Pop said. "If Atlahai had been able to do anything more for us, that is, if they hadn't been sieged in, they'd sure as anything have pulled the plane in, and picked us out of it, with a big pair of tweezers, likely as not. And contrary to your flattering opinion of my preaching, which, by the way, none of the religious boys in my outfit share, they call me that misguided old atheist, I don't think none of us would go over big at Atlahai." We had to agree with him there. I couldn't imagine Pop, or Alice, or even me cutting much of a figure, even if we weren't murder pariahs, with the pack of geniuses that seemed to make up the Atla Alamos crowd. The AA Republics, to give them a name, might have their small brain types, but somehow I didn't think so. There must be more than one Edison Einstein, it seemed to me, back of anti-gravity and all the wonders in this plane and the other things we'd gotten hints of. Also, Grail had seemed bred for brains as well as size, even if us small mammals had cooked his goose. And none of the modern countries had more than a few thousand population yet, I was pretty sure, and that hardly left room for a dumbbell class. Finally, too, I got a hold of a memory I'd been reaching for the last hour. How when I was a kid, I'd read about some scientists who learned to talk Mandarin just for kicks. I told Alice and Pop. "And if that's the average Atla Alamoser's idea of mental recreation," I said, "well, you can see what I mean." "I'll grant you they got a monopoly of brains," Pop agreed. "Not sense, though," he added doggedly. "Intellectual snobs," was Alice's comment. "I know the type, and I detest it." "Well, you are sort of an intellectual, aren't you?" Pop told her, which fortunately didn't start a riot. Still, I guess all three of us found it fun to chew over a bit the new slant we'd gotten on two, in a way, three of the great countries of the modern world, and as long as we thought of it as fun, we didn't have to admit the envy and wistfulness that was behind our wisecracks. I said, "We've always figured in a general way that Alamos was the remains of a community of scientists and technicians. Now we know the same's true of the Atlahai group. They're the Brookhaven survivors." "Manhattan Project, don't you mean?" Alice corrected. "Nope, that was in Colorado Springs," Pop said with finality. I also pointed out that a community of scientists would educate for technical intelligence, maybe breed for it too, and being a group picked for high IQ to begin with, they might make startlingly fast progress. You could easily imagine such folk, unimpeded by the boobs, creating a wonder world in a couple of generations. "They got their troubles, though," Pop reminded me, and that led to us speculating about the war we'd dipped into. Savannah Fortress, we knew, was supposed to be based on some big atomic plants on the river down that way, but its culture seemed to have a fiercer ingredient than Atla Alamos. Before we knew it, we were musing almost romantically about the plight of Atlahai, besieged by superior, and it was very easy to suppose, barbaric forces, and maybe distant Los Alamos in a similar predicament. Alice reminded me how the voice had asked if they were still dying out there. For a moment, I found myself fiercely proud that I had been able to strike a blow against evil aggressors. At once, of course, then the revulsion came. "This is a hell of a way," I said, for three so-called realists to be mooning about things. Yes, especially when your heroes kicked us out, Alice agreed. Pop chuckled. Yep, he said. They even took Ray's artillery away from him. You're wrong there, Pop, I said, sitting up. I still got one of the grenades, the one the pilot had in his fist. To tell the truth, I'd forgotten all about it, and it bothered me a little now to feel it snugged up in my pocket against my hip bone where the skin is thin. You believe what that old Dutchman said about the steel cubes being atomic grenades? Pop asked me. I don't know, I said. He sure didn't sound enthusiastic about telling us the truth about anything. But for that matter, he sounded mean enough to tell the truth, figuring we'd think it was a lie. Maybe this is some sort of baby A-bomb with a fuse timed like a grenade. I got it out and hefted it. How about I press the button and drop it out the door? Then we'll know. I really felt like doing it. Restless, I guess. Don't be a fool, Ray, Alice said. Don't tense up, I won't, I told her. At the same time, I made myself the little promise that if I ever got to feeling restless, that is, restless and bad, I'd just go ahead and punch the button and see what happened. Sort of leave my future up to the gods of the Deathlands, you might say. What makes you so sure it's a weapon? Pop asked. What else would it be? I asked him. That they'd be so hot on getting them in the middle of a war? I don't know for sure, Pop said. I've made a guess, but I don't want to tell it now. What I'm getting at, Ray, is that your first thought about anything you find, in the world outside or in your own mind, is that it's a weapon. Anything worthwhile in your mind is a weapon, Alice interjected with surprising intensity. You see, Pop said, that's what I mean about the both of you. That sort of thinking's been going on a long time. Caveman picks up a rock, and right away he asks himself, who can I brain with this? Doesn't occur to him for several 100,000 years to use it to start building a hospital. You know, Pop, I said, carefully tucking the cube back into my pocket, you are sort of preachy at times. Yes, I am, he said. How about some grub? It was a good idea. Another few minutes and we wouldn't have been able to see to eat, though with the cans shaped to tell their contents, I guess we'd have managed. It was a funny circumstance that in this wonder plane we didn't even know how to turn on the light, and a good measure of our general helplessness. We had our little feed and lit up again and settled ourselves in. I judged it would be an overnight trip, at least to the cracking plant. We weren't making anything like the speed we had been going east. Pop was sitting in back again, and Alice and I lay half-hitched around the kneeling seats, which allowed us to watch each other. Pretty soon, it got so dark we couldn't see anything of each other but the glowing tips of the cigarettes and a bit of face around the mouth when the person took a deep drag. They were a good idea, those cigarettes, kept us from having ideas about the other person starting to creep around with a knife in his hand. The North American screen still glowed dimly, and we could watch our green dot trying to make progress. The viewport was dead black at first, then there came the faintest sort of bronze blotch that very slowly shifted forward and down. The old moon, of course, going west ahead of us. After a while, I realized what it was like. An old Pullman car. I traveled in one once as a kid, or especially the smoker of an old Pullman, very late at night. Our crippled anti-gravity, working on the irregularities of the ground as they came along below, made the ride rhythmically bumpy, you see. I remembered how lonely and strange that old sleeping car had seemed to me as a kid. This felt the same. I kept waiting for a hoot or a whistle. It was the sort of loneliness that settles in your bones and keeps working at you. I recall the first man I ever killed, Pop started to reminisce softly. Shut up, Alice told him. Don't you ever talk about anything but murder, Pop? I guess not, he said. After all, it's the only really interesting topic there is. Do you know of another? It was silent in the cabin for a long time after that. Then Alice said, "It was the afternoon before my 12th birthday when they came into the kitchen and killed my father. He'd been wise, in a way, and had us living at a spot where the bombs didn't touch us, or the worst fallout. But he hadn't counted on the local werewolf gang. He'd just been slicing some bread, homemade from our own wheat. Dad was great on back to nature and all, but he laid down the knife. Dad couldn't see any object or idea as a weapon, you see. That was his great weakness. Dad couldn't even see weapons as weapons. Dad had a philosophy of cooperation. That was his name for it, that he was going to explain to people. Sometimes I think he was glad of the last war because he believed it would give him his chance. But the werewolves weren't interested in philosophy, and although their knives weren't as sharp as Dad's, they didn't lay them down. Afterwards, they had themselves a meal with me for dessert. I remember one of them used a slice of bread to sop up blood like gravy, and another washed his hands and face in the cold coffee. She didn't say anything else for a bit. Pop said softly, "That was the afternoon, wasn't it? That the fallen angels," and then just said, "My big mouth." "You were going to say the afternoon they killed God," Alice asked him. "You're right, it was. They killed God in the kitchen that afternoon. That's how I know he's dead. Afterwards, they would have killed me too, eventually, except..." Again, she broke off, this time to say, "Pop, do you suppose I can have been thinking about myself as the daughter of God all these years, that's why everything seems so intense?" "I don't know," Pop said. "The religious boys say we're all children of God. I don't put much stock in it, or else God sure has some lousy children. But go on with your story." "Well, they would have killed me too, except the leader took a fancy to me and got the idea of training me up for a were-girl or she-wolf Deb or whatever they called it. That was my first experience of ideas as weapons. He got an idea about me, and I used it to kill him. I had to wait 3 months for my opportunity. I got him so lazy, he let me shave him. He bled to death the same way as Dad." Pop commented after a bit. "That was a chiller, all right. I got to remember to tell it to Bill. It was somebody killing his mother that got him started. Alice, you had about as good a justification for your first murder as any I remember hearing." "Yet," Alice said, after another pause, with just a trace of the old sarcasm creeping back into her voice, "I don't suppose you think I was right to do it." "Right, wrong, who knows?" Pop said, almost blusteringly. "Sure, you were justified in a whole pack of ways. Anybody would sympathize with you. A man often has fine justification for the first murder he commits, but as you know, it's not that the first murder's always so bad in itself as that it's apt to start you on a killing spree. Your sense of values gets shifted a tiny bit, and it never shifts back. But you know all that. And who am I to tell you anything anyway? I've killed men because I didn't like the way they spit, and may very well do it again if I don't keep watching myself and my mind ventilated." "Well, Pop," Alice said, "I didn't always have such dandy justification for my killings. Last one was a moony old physicist. He fixed me the Geiger counter I carry. A silly old geek. I don't know how he survived so long. Maybe an exile or a runaway. You know, I often attach myself to the elderly do-gooder type like my father was. Or like you, Pop." Pop nodded. "It's good to know yourself," he said. There was a third pause, and then, although I hadn't exactly been intending to, I said, "Alice had justification for her first murder. Personal justification that an ape would understand. I had no personal justification at all for mine, yet I killed about 1 million people at a modest estimate. You see, I was the boss of the crew that took care of the hydrogen missile ticketed for Moscow, and when the ticket was finally taken up, I was the one to punch it. My finger on the firing button, I mean. I went on. Yeah, Pop, I was one of the button pushers. There were really quite a few of us, of course. That's why I get such a laugh out of stories about being or rubbing out the one guy who pushed all the buttons. That's so, Pop said, with only mild-sounding interest. In that case, you ought to know. We didn't get to hear right then who I ought to know, because I had a fit of coughing, and we realized the cigarette smoke was getting just too thick. Pop fixed the door so it was open a crack, and after a while the atmosphere got reasonably okay, though we had to put up with a low, lonely whistling sound. Yeah, I continued, I was the boss of the missile crew, and I wore a very handsome uniform with impressive insignia, not the bully old stripes I got on my chest now, and I was very young and handsome myself. We were all very young in that line of service, though a few of the men under me were a little older, young and dedicated. I remember feeling a very deep and grim and clean responsibility, but I wonder sometimes just how deep it went, or how clean it really was. I had an uncle, flew in the war they fought to lick fascism, bombardier on a flying fortress or something, and once he got drunk, he told me how some days it didn't bother him at all to drop the eggs on Germany. The buildings and people down there seemed just like toys that a kid sets up to kick over, and the whole business about as naive fun as poking an anthill. I didn't even have to fly over at 7 miles what I was going to be aiming at. Only I remember sometimes getting out a map and looking at a certain large dot on it and smiling a little and softly saying, "Pow," and then giving a little conventional shudder and folding up the map quick. Naturally, we told ourselves we'd never have to do it. Fire the thing, I mean. We joked about how after 20 years or so, we'd all be given jobs as museum attendants of the same bomb, deactivated at last. But naturally, it didn't work out that way. There came the day when our side of the world got hit, and the orders started cascading down from Defense Coordinator Bigelow. Bigelow? Pop interrupted. Not Joe Bigelow. Joseph A., I believe, I told him, a little annoyed. Why, he's my boy then, the one I was telling you about. The skinny runt, had this horn handle. Can you beat that? Pop sounded startlingly happy. Him and you will have a lot to talk about when you get together. I wasn't so sure of that myself. In fact, my first reaction was that the opposite would be true. To be honest, I was for the first moment more than a little annoyed at Pop for interrupting my story of my big grief, for it was that to me, make no mistake. Here, my story had finally been teased out of me, against all expectation, after decades of repression and in spite of dozens of assorted psychological blocks. And here was Pop interrupting it for the sake of a lot of trivial organizational gossip about Joes and Bills and Georges that we'd never heard of, and what they'd say or think. But then, all of a sudden, I realized that I didn't really care, that it didn't feel like a big grief anymore, that just starting to tell about it after hearing Pop and Alice tell their stories had purged it of that unnecessary weight of feeling that had made it a millstone around my neck. It seemed to me now that I could look down at Ray Baker from a considerable height, but not an angelic or contemptuously superior height, and ask myself not why he had grieved so much, that was understandable and even desirable, but why he had grieved so uselessly in such a stuffy little private hell. And it would be interesting to find out how Joseph A. Bigelow had felt. How does it feel, Ray, to kill 1 million people? I realized that Alice had asked me the question several seconds back, and it was hanging in the air. Well, that's just what I've been trying to tell you, I told her, and started to explain it all over again. The words poured out of me now. I won't put them down here, it would take too long, but they were honest words, as far as I knew, and they eased me. I couldn't get over it. Here were us three murderers feeling a trust and understanding and sharing a communion that I wouldn't have believed possible between any 2 or 3 people in the age of the Deaders, or in any age, to tell the truth. It was against everything I knew of Deathland psychology, but it was happening just the same. Oh, our strange isolation had something to do with it, I knew, and that Pullman car memory hypnotizing my mind, and our reactions to the voices and violence of Atla Alamos. But in spite of all that, I ranked it as a wonder. I felt an inward freedom and easiness that I never would have believed possible. Pop's little disorganized organization had really got hold of something. I couldn't deny it. 3 treacherous killers talking from the bottoms of their hearts and believing each other. For it never occurred to me to doubt that Pop and Alice were feeling exactly like I was. In fact, we were all so sure of it that we didn't even mention our communion to each other. Perhaps we were a little afraid that we would rub off the bloom. We just enjoyed it. We must have talked about 1,000 things that night, and smoked a couple of 100 cigarettes. After a while, we started taking little cat naps. We'd gotten too much off our chests, and come to feel too tranquil even for our excitement to keep us awake. I remember the first time I dozed, waking up with a cold start and grabbing for Mother, and then hearing Pop and Alice gabbing in the dark, and remembering what had happened, and relaxing again with a smile. Of all things, Pop was saying, "Yep, I imagine Ray must be good to make love to. Murderers almost always are. They got the fire. It reminds me of what a guy named Fred told me. One of our boys..." Mostly, we took turns going to sleep, though I think there were times when all 3 of us were snoozing. About the 5th time I woke up, after some tighter shut-eye, the orange soup was back again, and Alice was snoring gently in the next seat, and Pop was up and had one of his knives out. "Another day, another pack of troubles," he said cheerfully. The tone of his remark jangled my nerves, as that tone generally does in the early morning. I squeezed my eyes. "Where are we?" I asked. He poked his elbow toward the North America screen. The 2 green dots were almost one. "My God, we're practically there," Alice said for me. She'd waked fast, Deathland style. "I know," Pop said, concentrating on what he was doing. "But I aim to be shaved before they commence landing maneuvers." "You think automatic will land us?" Alice asked. "What if we just start circling around?" "We can figure out what to do when it happens," Pop said, whittling away at his chin, using butter as shaving cream. "Until then, I'm not interested. There's still a couple of bottles of coffee in the sack. I've had mine." I didn't join in this chit-chat because the green dots and Alice's first remark had reminded me of a lot deeper reason for my jangled nerves than Pop's cheerfulness. Night was gone with its shielding cloak and its feeling of being able to talk forever, and the naked day was here with its demands for action. It is not so difficult to change your whole view of life when you are flying or even bumping along the ground with friends who understand, but soon I knew I'd be down in the dust with something I never wanted to see again. "Coffee, Ray?" "Yeah, I guess so." I took the bottle from Alice and wondered whether my face looked as glum as hers. "They shouldn't salt butter," Pop asserted. "It makes it lousy for shaving." "It was the best butter," Alice said. "Yeah," I said, "the dormouse when they buttered the watch." It may be true that feeble humor is better than none. I don't know. "What are you 2 yakking about?" Pop demanded. "A book we both read," I told him. "Either of you writers?" Pop asked with sudden interest. "Some of the boys think we should have a book about us. I say it's too soon, but they say we might all die off or something." "Whoa, Jenny, easy does it. Gently, please." The last remark was by way of recognizing that the plane had started an authoritative turn to the left. I got a sick and cold feeling, This was it. Pop sheathed his knife and gave his face a final rub. Alice belted on her satchel. I reached for my knapsack, but I was staring through the viewport, dead ahead. The haze lightened faintly 3 times. I remembered the St. Elmo's fire that had flamed from the cracking plant. "Pop," I said, almost whined, to be truthful. "Why'd the bugger have to land here in the first place? He was rushing stuff they needed bad to Atla High. Why'd he have to break his trip?" "That's easy," Pop said. "He was being a bad boy. At least that's my theory. He was supposed to go straight to Atla High, but there was somebody he wanted to check up on first. He stopped here to see his girlfriend. Yep, his girlfriend. She tried to warn him off. That's my explanation of the juice that flared out of the cracking plant and interfered with his landing, though I'm sure she didn't intend the last. By the way, whatever she turned on to give... By the way, whatever she turned on to give him the warning must still be turned on. But Grail came on down in spite of it." Before I could assimilate that, the 7 deformed gas tanks materialized in the haze. We got the freeway in our sights and steadied and slowed and kept slowing. The plane didn't graze the cracking plant this time, though I'd have sworn it was going to hit it head on. When I saw we weren't going to hit it, I wanted to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. The stain was black now, and the pilot's body thicker than I remembered, bloated. But that wouldn't last long. 3 or 4 vultures were working on it. That's the end of chapter 6. There is, in fact, only 1 chapter left. So if I get the chance, I'll try to finish that up this weekend. It's a slim chance, though. I've got a lot of stuff I have to do. I will try for Tuesday or Monday instead then, and then we can wrap that up and find something new to read. You know what? We'll start looking around on Gutenberg and see what's up. And yeah, we'll go from there. All right, folks, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening. As always, Aindulmedir is the best. Find him on Bandcamp or Spotify or YouTube. This time we're listening to Starlore for this story. It's one of his more recent albums. Go check it out. And I'll see you folks next time. Thanks for hanging out, as always, and I hope you're enjoying the story. Have a good weekend.